Hello everyone and welcome back to Clover Knows Pets. I'm Clover and today I'm going to be showing you how to set up a closed terrarium. Now there are a lot of misconceptions about these self-sustaining pieces of art, so I'm hoping to disprove a lot of them today. If you didn't already know, I've been making and selling terrariums for 6 years now, so I do feel quite qualified to talk about this subject. But nonetheless, there are a lot of different ways to make a closed terrarium, and this is only one of them. Anyways, let's get started. First thing you're going to need is a jar. Now you can make a terrarium out of pretty much any jar that has a sealing top, which would be meaning that something like this would not work. And for best results, you also want to make sure that you do not have any patterns on the jar, since it'll be very hard to see through those. And if your jar has any sticky bits, those are washed off. That way you can actually see into the jar itself and see your terrarium. But for today's video, I'm going to be using this one here. I like this one since it has a very smooth surface, and it has a silicone rim, so it is completely sealed. Anyways, the next step is to add a drainage layer. Now, depending on the size of the jar you are using, you're going to want to use either pea gravel, leca clay balls, or coarse natural play sand. For small terrariums like this one, coarse natural play sand is going to be the best. But if you're doing a medium terrarium, you're going to want to use pea gravel. And if you're doing a extra large terrarium, you're going to want to use something like leca clay balls. Anyways, I don't have any natural play sand on me right now, so instead, just for the demonstration, I will be using Repti sand. Just keep in mind this certainly isn't ideal. Anyways, for a terrarium of this size, you're going to want around 1/2 inch deep of this. And then if you'd like, you can add a separation layer to separate the drainage layer from the substrate that will be going in shortly. And that can be made from fiberglass window screen, geotextile fabric, or simply a plastic bag with holes poked in it. Something great about terrariums is there are a lot of different things you can do with them, and nothing is really a set rule, as long as you're following basic guidelines. Anyways, moving on to substrate. There are a lot of different terrarium substrates you can buy, but I personally like to make my own, so here's how you do it. First, you're going to want some dried moss. Then you're going to add Eco Earth. If you don't know what that is, it is basically it's ground up coconut husk, but it is from a brand called Zoomed, and it comes in bricks. You mix it with water and they expand, creating this moist substrate. Next, I'm adding some organic potting soil, and finally some more sand like the stuff you saw before. Mix it all up. And then we're going to moisten it just because it is a little dry. Anyways, the next step is to put the substrate into the terrarium itself, which means it's probably about time we talk about terrarium tools. Now, there are a lot more than just these 4, but for a beginner, these kinds are probably the best to start out with. First of all, straight ones. This is good when you're trying to place things into your terrarium. Next, elbow tweezers. These are good when you're working to reposition things in your terrarium. Terrarium scissors or aquascaping scissors are great for trimming your terrarium once it's been set up for a while and needs to be trimmed. And also for trimming plants once you first set up your terrarium. And a fan brush is good to reposition substrate and plants once they've been set in your terrarium. Once you've got your substrate positioned the way you'd like it, it's time to move on to the heartscape. Now, there are a lot of different ways you can use a heartscape piece. You can use it to help with the theme of a terrarium, or to bring attention to it itself and take away attention from the plants, or do the opposite and bring the attention solely to the plants, or even add a direction in the tank. Since I want to focus mostly on the plants in my terrarium, I'm going to be using a small piece of wood here as my heartscape instead of something large. Using pieces that move in one direction are normally best for beginners, since they add a sort of direction to the tank, which you can sort of use to build the rest of the setup, and it normally ends up looking really nice. Since I do have a fairly wide-mouthed terrarium, I can just set it in, but if you have a smaller mouth terrarium, then you may want to use tweezers. There we go. Next up, plants. Now, the easiest plant to use in a beginner terrarium is definitely going to be moss. For beginners, it's normally best to either buy moss or forage it yourself, but since I do a lot of terrariums, I do have a designated moss and small plant bin where I actually culture or grow my own moss and plants. So I will be using that today. Just keep in mind this isn't the only way to do it. Also, if you're taking moss from outside, make sure you only take a small section instead of a large clump. That way the moss can replenish itself, and you're not taking away a whole ecosystem, but instead a small piece to start your own. Anyways, let's choose our moss. I'm just choosing a few different kinds here to help add dimension to the terrarium, but this certainly is not necessary. I'm also going to be adding a small bit of string of turtles, but like I said, you don't have to add this, and a terrarium will work just fine with nothing but moss. Alright, this should be good to start. I'm going to start with this piece here since it has the most chunky moss, as you'd say, or at least the moss with the largest leaves. Next, I'm going to add the medium-sized moss. Keep in mind, too, that you can always break moss into chunks if the singular piece is too big. You can also trim off bottom areas of your moss if it's too thick. At this point, the sides of my jar are getting a little dirty, and so I'm just going to spray some of that off. That way I can see inside a little better. Finally, I'm going to be adding the smallest kinds of moss. There we go. Now that all that's left is to add any plants, if you're going to add that. Then we can add our cleanup crew. Next, you're going to add your cleanup crew, properly known as mesofauna. Now, for smaller terrariums, you're going to want to use springtails. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of springtails, and they all work slightly differently. These here are tropical springtails. Oh my god, I said isopods, sorry, no, springtails. These here are blue Podora springtails. They're a lot smaller. And finally, temperate springtails. Based off of experience and studies I've done, temperate springtails definitely work the best, but only by a little, so don't stress if you're going to use another kind. Adding springtails to your terrarium is super easy. All you have to do is add extra water, and since springtails float, they will start gathering, and you can pour them in. It's as easy as that. Now that they are in the terrarium, it's time to move on to the last step, adding water to your terrarium. Now, obviously, since we moistened the substrate and pour water in with the springtails, there is already some water in there, but you do want to make sure that you have enough that is going to sustain the terrarium long term. So I will be adding a little bit more. Also, don't worry about it getting too moist in there, because any excess water will go down to the drainage layer from before. After you moisten your terrarium, all that's left to do is put a lid on it, and then find it a nice moist place. Oh my god, I just said moist. Nice bright place to stay. There we go. Then just let it sit there and watch it grow. The reason it's so self-sustaining is because once the plants and moss grow to be overly tall, they will die off. That will then mold, and the springtails will eat the mold and then decaying matter. Then their poop becomes fertilizer for more plants and moss to grow. And that whole time, water is heating up, evaporating to the top, and then running back down the glass, back into the soil, heating up, evaporating, and it is cycling over and over and over. Over time, your terrarium will also gain its own microfauna, which is basically a bunch of beneficial bacteria that keep it clean on the microscopic scale. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!